Thank you. I'm very happy to have been invited to talk. So in this talk, I'm going to examine some of the ways in which natural language processing and computational linguistics research serves power. So as a U.S. citizen who lives most of the time in the United States, I'll be speaking from this perspective, and so I'll be talking a lot about race and racism in the U.S., but I encourage you to think about the ways in which these issues might apply to wherever you happen to hail from. So the goal of this talk is to sort of have a conversation. So not necessarily to provide answers, but to ask questions. To think about what we do and why. Broadly, I want to think about three questions. First, whose interests does NLP as it currently is defined, however that is, serve? And who is setting the agenda? Will all research ultimately serve power? And how does one work in a field without being co-opted by it, where it is power? So I should say as a disclaimer that I'm not attacking individuals in this talk. The point is to think about systems and incentives and the structures and how they influence what we do. Brief outline. So first I'll talk about some context for this talk and think about bias, and I'll use a sort of innocuous example from my own work with other people from EMNLP last year, and then look at some more sinister examples, you could say. And then talk about fixes and why we should be careful about what we think of as fixes, and then some final thoughts where I'll think about this in the framework of, we'll get to it. So it's well documented in computer vision that one can trick a model into misidentifying an image with high confidence. You can use this example from Goodfellow et al. 2014 as an example. So by adding some carefully designed noise to an image of a panda, you can trick the classifier into thinking that it's a given with high confidence. Such quote-unquote pathologies also occur in NLP tasks. So if you look at this example from Squad, for example, then you have here a question that you want to answer based on some paragraph that's not shown here. And if you remove words in a certain order, then you can see the confidence change as you remove more and more words. And in fact, the confidence is going up as you remove these words, which is not what we would like. And so by the end, we just have the word did, and the confidence of the classifier is at 0.91. So if you do this input reduction method on different tasks, you end up with similar results. So in this visual question answering example, which may or may not look green, you can reduce the question to just flower with a question mark, and the confidence almost changes none. So can this be mitigated? Yes, you can actually modify the objective function to try to optimize for high entropy on such examples, but that is not the point of this talk. So let's, so ideally what we'd want this model to do is say, I don't know, like when it doesn't have enough information in these situations. So another way of thinking about it is that we want roughly uniform probabilities over all the possible answers or a highly entropic distribution. Okay, so these pathologies are obviously problematic in the abstract, but I'm more interested in this talk in the effects of problematic models and problematic deployment of such models on people. And I'll add a disclaimer. So I'm not trying to essentialize any notion of race in this talk or reify it. Unfortunately, such notions of race are codified in societies and have long-standing social consequences. So when I talk about black or white, I am not assuming that these are ontologically coherent or consistent categories. Okay, so let's start with an obvious example for many people who have thought about this. Using biased data. So following Kalaskin et al. 2017, I'm going to use the word prejudice rather than merely bias to describe the behavior of certain kinds of models or algorithms, and which through bias have deleterious effects on populations. So they examined word embeddings in a now classic study that found, quote, every linguistic bias documented in psychology that they looked for in glove embeddings. It may not be apparent to those not from the US, but there are certain names that are statistically much more likely to, that statistically are more likely to be given to Black versus white Americans respectively. And they found that white American names were associated with pleasant words and Black American names were associated with negative words like criminal. So they found similar results for gender, with women's names being associated with the arts and men's names being more associated with science. So obviously, word embeddings are ubiquitous in NLP, and this can have serious consequences for downstream tasks, such as machine translation. While not necessarily directly related to word embedding, you might remember that recently there was a bit of a problem with Amazon's job interview selection algorithm. And if we look, this graph was taken from a Reuters article. If you look at the distribution of male versus female headcounts in top tech companies, it's not hard to see why this might have been missed. In her book, Algorithms of Oppression, Safiya Noble examines the particular effects that Google search algorithms, or the particular ways in which they were racist against Black girls. So you may not be able to see it here, but at this point, if you typed in why are Black women so, you got results like angry, loud, mean, etc. So it's well documented in the US by an organization called FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, that media representations of Black victims of police violence, a daily occurrence, smear the victims when they are Black using so-called cop speak. Incidentally, if anyone wants an interesting research project, you might try identifying cop speak in the media. Anyway, consider the case of Timothy Kaufman, who was murdered in cold blood by a white supremacist. This is a quote from the New York Daily News. Kaufman lived in transitional housing on West 36th Street that serves people with HIV/AIDS. Praxis Housing Initiatives holds a contract with the city. He has 11 prior arrests, including for marijuana, assault, resisting arrest, and menacing. This one's from the New York Post. Kaufman, who has 11 prior arrests, walked for about a block after the stabbing and staggered into the Midtown South Precinct looking for help. He died hours later after being rushed to a nearby hospital. Police sources said the career criminal was refusing to talk to police about the incident and acting combative before his death. So how is this relevant to NLP? Well, what would a model which learns to associate Black names with crime do when trained on headlines full of racist anti-Black headlines? Well, it would do something like this. This is a headline from the LA Times that was automatically generated. It says, Keith Lamont Scott had a complicated past, 5 arrests, prison, 20 years of marriage, a good review at work. The article itself continues to talk about his completely irrelevant, quote, troubled history. So I suppose we could say it's impressive that the model can so masterfully regurgitate the nuanced racism of the American media. Here's another case highlighted in Ruha Benjamin's book. In 2016, searching for 3 Black teenagers predictably returned results of mugshots, while searching for 3 white teenagers returned images of smiling youths. 3 Asian teenagers yielded scantily clad teens. To this day, and I checked this last night, searching for Black teens on Google Images and other search engines returns some disturbing results. I'll leave it to you to try it. Explicit censorship, as also practiced by Google and other information companies around the world, isn't necessary for racist propaganda. So Noble, in her book, describes the situation this way. Google's monopoly status, coupled with its algorithmic practices of biasing information toward the interests of the neoliberal capital and social elites in the United States, has resulted in a provision of information that purports to be credible but is actually a reflection of advertising interests. Muhammad et al. 2019 note that Google AdSense allowed advertisers to use racist natural language phrases for targeted advertising. In this image, taken from a 2017 BuzzFeed news article, you can see keyword phrases like, quote, "Black people ruin everything" and "Jews control the media." This is a bit older, but Sweeney 2013 found that black identifying names are 25% more likely to return results suggestive of an arrest record than others. She discovered this by searching for her own name. So I'd like to take a moment to note that while I'm not saying that any of these incidents were intentional, we shouldn't be naive enough to think that it never is. In her book, Ruha Benjamin notes that, quote, "The notion that tech bias is unintentional or unconscious obscures reality, that there is no way to create something without some intention and intended user in mind." She recounts an account shared by someone at the Data for Black Lives conference, which is the following. A former Apple employee described his experience on a team that was developing speech recognition for Siri. As they worked on several English dialects, he asked his boss, "What about African American English?" To which his boss responded, "Well, Apple products are for the premium market." I'll leave that for you to ponder. So this is problematic and racist on a number of levels, but what this is the same kind of implicit logic of so much of what is done in NLP. Okay, so we've looked at some horrific but mostly bumbling instances of racist NLP. So unfortunately, things are actually worse than that. This is where we start the controversial part of the talk. So let's talk about NLP and social control. So there's something I'd like you to keep in mind during the remainder of this talk, which is that the most vulnerable, most marginalized people will always be hurt the most by these systems. So again, those not from the US, and many US citizens, unfortunately, may not be familiar with the term Jim Crow. It's complicated, but basically it refers to laws that prevented black people from voting, eating at restaurants, going to the bathroom, existing, and so on. So the law against existing is not an exaggeration, as you'll learn if you read about vagrancy laws. But Michelle Alexander's best-selling book, The New Jim Crow, details how despite the fact that most, but not all of these laws were technically overturned after decades and centuries of fighting, the powers that be have managed to achieve similar results through different means. And it's no coincidence that the US has about a quarter of the world's prisoners, despite being 5% of the population, and 40% of those is black, and another 20% are Latino. The relevance of this will become apparent shortly. This means that 1 in 10 prisoners in the world is a black American. I'll say that again. 1 in 10 prisoners in the world is a black American, despite the fact that they're only 0.057% of the world's population. Now, Benjamin describes the new Jim Code, which is a pun on the new Jim Crow, as, quote, "the employment of new technologies that reflect and reproduce existing inequities, but that are promoted and perceived as more objective or progressive than the discriminatory systems of a previous era." Now, I'm going to claim that technology has always been used to dominate other people, and NLP is no different in this regard. The language technologies we develop will enable surveillance and control at a granularity and scale never before possible in human history. Scientists and engineers have always been the handmaidens of empire and exploitation, and now is no different. NLP research agendas are largely set by the United States and its clients' desire for domination and control, and by corporations whose goal is to enrich themselves. This is true of AI more generally. Let's look at some of the darker ways in which machine learning is being used for surveillance, which is itself a form of social control. If you're outside of the United States, you might not be familiar with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which has been transformed into a kind of neo-fascist organization implementing a kind of ethnic cleansing in the United States. Both the FBI and ICE use facial recognition, which is not NLP, but again, hold on just a little bit and you'll see the connection, as do law enforcement in France, China, Australia, and several other countries. So it's worth noting that white males give the lowest false match rate in these systems, as others have mentioned today already. And there have been many instances of people being misidentified and arrested multiple times because of these systems. If this is most likely to happen to people of color who are already targeted, whom will these systems hurt the most? By the way, Amazon has been marketing its facial recognition software recognition to ICE. This is from an article in The Intercept and worth quoting at length. The NYPD acquired IBM's video analytics software as one part of the domain awareness system, a shared project of the police department and Microsoft that centralized a vast web of surveillance sensors in lower and midtown Manhattan, including cameras, license plate readers, and radiation detectors, into a unified dashboard. IBM entered the picture as a subcontractor to Microsoft's subsidiary Vexel in 2004 as part of a project worth $60.7 million over 6 years. It continues. In New York, the terrorist threat was an easy selling point, recalled an IBM researcher who worked on the initial NYPD video analytics installation. You say, look at what the terrorists did before. They could come back, so you give us some money and we'll put a camera there. So here, as usual, you have researchers doing the technical legwork, which only they can do, which only we can do, for mass surveillance. It's worth noting that San Francisco just banned the use of facial recognition surveillance after a study by Joy Buolamwini. I have trouble pronouncing her last name. Her Algorithmic Justice League also sent a letter to Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, and incidentally the richest man on earth, pointing out that these systems disproportionately harm non-white people and women. By the way, Bezos, along with executives from Google, Instagram, and LinkedIn, sit on the Pentagon's Defense Innovation Advisory Board. What does this have to do with NLP? A lot, actually. Consider the NSA's so-called, quote, Google for Voice, which they've had since at least 2004. This software, which could match a voice with previous recordings, wasn't just used to catch terrorists, documents suggest. It was also intended to track whistleblowers. Trevor Timm, executive director of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, said this: "There are microphones all around us all the time. We all carry around a microphone 24 hours a day in the form of our cell phones. And we know that there are ways for the government to hack into phones and computers to turn those devices on." Nuance, an industry leader, advertises to governments, military, and intelligence services on a, Nuance, an industry leader, advertises to governments, military, and intelligence services, quote, a countrywide voice biometric system capable of rapidly and accurately identifying and segmenting individuals within systems comprising millions of voice prints, unquote. In 2014, the Associated Press reported that Nuance's technology had been used by Turkey's largest mobile phone company to collect voice data from approximately 10 million customers. Quote, by developing programs to automatically translate speech into text, what analysts call Google for Voice, the NSA could use keywords and selectors to search, read, and index recordings that would have otherwise required an infinite number of human listeners to listen to them. Now, a brief history lesson. For context, the COINTELPRO program existed from 1956 to 1971. Under it, the U.S. government spied on, harassed, and even assassinated black activists. You can and should read about this totalitarian program, but for the sake of time, let's just note that though the program officially ended in 1971, these tactics are still used, and the FBI has a program targeting so-called black identity extremists, defined so broadly as to describe anyone they don't like. Here, by the way, is the letter that was sent to Martin Luther King Jr. to try to blackmail him to commit suicide by the FBI. What about fixing these algorithms? We need to be careful not to frame marginalized groups as the problem. As Ruha Benjamin puts it, by, quote, embracing a racialized notion of problem people. She says, racial fixes are better understood as part of the underlying code of the operating systems, often developed as solutions to particular kinds of predicaments without sufficient awareness of the problems that they help produce and preserve. So maybe the problem isn't the people who are hurt by our methods, maybe the problem is what we're trying to do in the first place. And I just lost my notes, but that's fine. So the 5 filters in research. So the 5 filters were described by Herman and Chomsky in Manufacturing Consent to describe the ways in which thought control is exercised in a free society through the media. And the idea is basically that in a society where people are controlled by the threat of violence, you don't have to control how people think because you control them through violence. But in a free society like ostensibly the United States or say the UK or other places, you can't do that so overtly, so you have to control how people think. And so there are 5 filters that in this model that the information goes through in the media before it gets to you. One of them is ownership. So basically, the media are owned by large conglomerates, and so they're not going to publish information that hurts them. The second is advertising interests. So if advertising is your funding model, then you're not going to be too offensive toward the pan that feeds you. Next is the media elite. And these are the people who are selected to be representative of the truth. So you have national security analysts that come from, say, the Pentagon or the CIA, or you have people who have been filtered to not be too offensive. And then you have flack, which I'm looking forward to after this talk, which occurs when you go outside the bounds of what you're supposed to say. So for example, if you say something, if you speak up for oppressed people, you're often framed as a problem person or as someone who's a little unhinged. And last is the common enemy, which is who we're all supposed to hate. So if you think about this, you can apply this to research, the kinds of questions we ask, the kinds of research we do. Who owns the research? Who sets the agenda? Where does the money come from? That's number 1. Advertising. How much of this money that is coming through is driven by advertising, and how does this affect the research agendas and what we do? The media elite. In this case, maybe we're not thinking about the media, but who are the research elite, and where do they come from, and what are their goals? Flack. What happens if you criticize Google or Facebook or Amazon or whoever happens to be prominent in the field? Will you not get a job from them? Will you not get funding from them? Does that color how we address these problems? Does that cover why we don't address them in maybe the way that we should? And I'll leave you to think about number 5. Final thoughts. So this is a quote from Timnit Gebru in an interview with the MIT Technology Review in 2018. There is bias to what kinds of problems we think are important, what kinds of research we think are important, and where we think AI should go. If we don't have diversity in our set of researchers, we are not going to address problems that are faced by the majority of people in the world. When problems don't affect us, we don't think they're important, and we might not even know what these problems are, because we're not interacting with the people who are experiencing them. And final word of caution about surface level diversity initiatives. So on the top, you have a program advertising girls' interests in STEM sponsored by Lockheed Martin, the largest weapons maker in the world. And on the bottom, you have a screenshot from the White House which is investing billions of dollars in artificial intelligence. And I hope we can agree that if your interests are aligned with the current White House, maybe that is cause for pause. Some more final thoughts. So research is largely driven by large corporations and the military. And by that I mean the US military and its clients. So even if your country doesn't have a military, the US largely sets the agenda, and so you end up furthering their interests anyway, simply because they're so influential. Scientists are and always have been the handmaidens of social control and oppression of marginalized groups, and even if we tell ourselves that we're not doing that, I think that there's plenty of evidence to the contrary. And NLP in the current state is at the forefront of it. Universities should challenge this power, not serve it. But of course, because of the incentive structures, it's much easier to serve power and align with it. Window dressing of diversity won't change anything. What is considered legitimate research is implicitly racialized. Why is it that so few people are talking about these issues straightforwardly? Most impositions of authority in research are from dominant colonial societies built off of the exploitation of people who are now struggling for acceptance. So in the United States, for example, the United States' existence is predicated on the genocide of Native people and the enslavement of Africans, who are now systematically excluded from these very fields and who are being negatively affected by them. Finally, again, this talk has been US-centric, but how does this apply to your society? We tend to think of naturally occurring data as a natural resource. If so, then isn't our current relationship with it extractive? What are the implications of this? I don't have the answer. And then I'll leave you with a quote from Angela Davis, the professor and activist. In a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist, we must be anti-racist. And that requires taking risks, and it requires thinking about and asking difficult questions. And I have some recommended reading for anyone who's interested, and thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take questions.